Hello everyone, I am Chanaka and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I am going to explain how you can expose a basic authentication secured service using WSO2 API Manager. So in this scenario, the backend service is protected with the basic authentication, while the APIs created within the API Manager is protected with the WSO2 protocol. So in this scenario, one of the common use cases you can find in the enterprises is that the actual backend services which are running for years need not to be modified when we introduce a new platform like an API Manager. So let's see how we can achieve this using the WSO2 API Manager. To achieve this, we have two solutions. So the first solution would be, when we are creating the API from the WSO2 API Manager, we configure a static authentication user with the backend service. So in this scenario, what actually happens is, for each and every request which is coming to the WSO2 API Manager, it will communicate to the backend with the same username and password as a basic authentication header. Even though this has some drawbacks, this has some advantages as well. So the drawback is, if the backend service is relying on the basic authentication information to provide the response, then it will be a problem, because we are always sending the same basic authentication information to the backend from the API Manager. But that's not the common case. In most cases, this basic authentication header is used just for authentication. So in that kind of a scenario, this approach makes sense, because here the WSO2 API Manager can be considered as a trusted application for the backend service, and you can create a user to represent the API Manager and configure that as a static configuration in the API which you created in the WSO2 API Manager. Then from the client side, client can send the WSO2 token with the authorization header. But let's say that the actual backend needs to get the real username and password of the end client. So in that kind of a scenario, we can't use this solution. So that is where the solution 2 comes into the solution. So here what actually we are doing is, instead of sending a static basic authentication information to the backend, we are taking the basic authentication information from the client through the authorization header and pass it back to the service. But the problem here is, since WSO2 API Manager provides the WSO2 security for APIs, the WSO2 token also needs to be presented from the client when it consumes an API from the API Manager. So the WSO2 token also comes through authorization header as a bearer token. So due to that, WSO2 API Manager provides the capability to modify the header name which carries the WSO2 token. You can configure a custom name for the header which is carrying the authorization token. In this case, you can see here, WSO2 header is the header name which carries the bearer token. So in this scenario, the client can send the basic authentication information through the authorization header while sending the bearer token through the WSO2 header. Let's see how we can achieve this. So in this demonstration, I am going to use WSO2 Enterprise Integrator to host my basic authentication secured service, and I am using WSO2 API Manager to create the API. So I have these products running on my laptop. I have the EI640, API Manager 260, and the API Manager Analytics. And also I am using a sample backend service which is providing me a simple response to the secured service which is hosted in the EI. Let's see what is actually hosted in the Enterprise Integrator. So in the Enterprise Integrator, I have uploaded this Carbon application, demo basic composite application, which contains the basic authentication protected proxy service. Here it contains the policy as well. So this proxy service is running on the EI with this endpoint. Let's go and try to execute this endpoint. So I'm going to use the SOAP UI. So here you can see I'm going to copy the URL here, and I am going to send a sample request. It's a simple payload to this proxy service. So here I have configured the authentication or the authorization as basic authorization and given the username and password. So if I see the row request, I can see the authorization header with the basic information. Let's go and execute this service. Alright, so I got the response. So in the response I have got the WS security header as well. Alright, so we have this backend service running. Let's go and create an API out of this. So I'm going to log into the API publisher. And I am going to create a new API. Let's design a new REST API. Let's give the name basic authentication, say B authentication static let's say BA static as the context, and we can give the version we want. We can add information like tags, and we can create a resource with post method. Let's go to the implement section and provide the endpoint details. I am going to use the SOAP endpoint. So the endpoint information is localhost 8245 services basic auth proxy. The service is running and which is available. So if you remember here, we have got in the response we are getting the WS security header from the actual backend service. So I am going to remove that from the response by enabling a custom mediation sequence. So I am going to use the custom mediation sequence in the outflow, that is where the response comes into the API manager. And I am going to use this security header remover custom mediation sequence. The source code of this sequence is available here. Here I am just using the header mediator to remove this WS security header. Let's go and finish creating the API. Alright. Select some subscription tiers and save and publish. Alright, so the API is created. Let's go to the APIs too and see whether this API is available. Alright, B authentication static API is available. Let's go and sign into the APIs too. And we need to subscribe to this API using an application. I am going to use the default application and subscribe to it. So So now I have subscribed to it. Now I get the URL here of the API, and I am trying to execute this API from the SOAP UI. I give the URL here. So here I am going to remove these previously added headers. Alright, so this is my URL which is exposed through the API Manager. Now I need to provide the WSO2 token. This is the token as my authorization header from the client side. So we can send that as a bearer token. Alright, so one thing I forgot to configure in the API is the authentication information to the backend. So I forgot to configure that. So here I need to go to the show more options, and the endpoint security scheme is secured. Then the authentication type, you can select basic code, and this is where you need to provide that static user information which will be used for authenticating with the backend service through the basic authentication header. Alright. Now I have saved the API. So the API is available and the token is available. We don't need to change anything here. So now we have the token, we have the URL of the API, and let's go and execute. I'll remove this one. Alright, so I got the response. So here what actually happened was, if I go back to the diagram here, has connected with the backend service with the basic auth information, which is what we configured in the API. So the client has sent the WSO2 token through the authorization bearer header. So let's see how we can configure the second scenario. Let's go to the API publisher and create a new API. Alright, so let's see. Be authentication dynamic, and we can say be a dynamic, give the version, and give the same endpoint address. And here, instead of providing the basic authentication option here, we are going to skip that option, and we'll need to provide the custom mediation sequence to remove the WS security header. And here we are going to provide the authorization header name, which will be used to carry the WSO2 token. Let's say WSO2 header, and that will be used as the carrier for the WSO2 token from the client. Let's select these two. Alright, so now the API is created with the name Be Authentication Dynamic. Let's go to the API store. Here you can see the Be Authentication Dynamic API. So I have already logged into the store and I am going to subscribe to it. Okay, I am subscribed to it. Now the endpoint is available. Let's take this endpoint and add that endpoint here. Alright, so now I need to send the O2 token in a different header. So in the authorization header, now I am going to send the basic information, basic, and the base64 encoded value of the username password. In this case, I am going to copy that from here. Then I need to add a new header with the custom name which we have provided, and it will carry the bearer token. You can get the token from here. Here you can see the same header name. Alright, so now we have the authorization information, the basic authorization information in the basic header, authorization header, and the O2 token to the custom O2 header. Let's try to execute this. Alright, we got the same response. If we remove this, we should get the same response. Okay, so that's how you can implement with a custom authorization header. So here what we have done is we have used the authorization header to send the basic information while using a custom header to send the O2 token. And this basic authorization header will be passed back to the backend service, and it will do the authentication and provide the response as required. That's all for today. Thanks for listening in. We'll catch you in the next session.